right, it is 2 p.m. Eastern time, so we will go ahead and get started. I know a few other people are still joining the session, but I want to respect our panelists' time and go ahead and start on time here. Welcome, everybody. This is the first day of the workshops for the Phi Alpha Delta conventions, our first session, so we are very excited to be kicking this off. I want to say thank you very much to George Mason University's National Security Institute for coordinating this panel. We are very excited to do this. It is a very relevant topic. I'm sure you all will have a lot of questions for the panelists. So as a reminder, please, be respectful in your questions and answering. And part of that is, raising your hand if you'd like to make a question, whether that is physically on your camera or using the raise hand Zoom feature. Please use the chat to ask questions as things are going, and it will be at the panelists' discretion what they answer and everything like that. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. If you guys have any questions, please do let me know. But for now, I will turn it over to Jamil Jaffer, the moderator of this panel. Jamil, it's all yours.
Awesome. Emily, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to Phi Alpha Delta and to all the members for joining us here today. Really appreciate you having us. And I'm excited to bring you guys a panel today, about this critical issue about foreign disinformation and their effect on our elections. In particular, and covert influence. In particular, I wanted to note that all of us that are here today are associated with the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. And it was founded about 3 years ago to really bring together folks to talk about the challenges facing American national security and to come up with clear, coherent, actionable recommendations for people in policy, members of Congress, people in the administration, to make changes to our national security posture to make it more robust and more capable. I'm excited to introduce these three members of our panel today. Matthew Ferraro, he's a visiting fellow at NSI and a senior associate at the international law firm of Wilmer Cutler, Pickering, and Hale and Dorr. Matthew writes widely on national security, cybersecurity, legal issues. Before entering the legal profession, he served in multiple staff, policy, and operational positions with the Office of Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, and the CIA. Lisa Kaplan is an NSI visiting fellow and the founder of Alethea Group, which helps organizations navigate the new digital reality and protect themselves against disinformation. Previously, she served as digital director for Senator Angus King's re-election campaign in 2018 and worked as a consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers at the State Department. And finally, last but certainly not least, Megan Stiefel, who I've worked closely with for a long time, an NSI visiting fellow and the founder of Silicon Harbor Consultants, a firm that provides strategic cybersecurity operations and policy counsel. She currently serves as a senior policy counsel at the Global Cyber Alliance and previously served as a director for international cyber policy at the National Security Council. So Matthew, Lisa, Megan, thanks for joining us. And we're going to jump right in. I've got some questions, but I'd love to hear stuff from the audience and get their thoughts and questions in also. So let's start with you, Lisa. The modern spread of disinformation, particularly through social media platforms and other methodologies on the internet, WhatsApp and the like, is viewed by lots as a national security threat, including particularly perhaps in democracies. So, of course, we've seen disinformation, for hundreds of years, right? Why should we be worried about disinformation now? And is it worse today than it was previously? And is it worse than it was during the Cold War, the Vietnam War? Like, what should we think about disinformation in this moment?
That's a really good question. So thank you, first of all, for having me. Excited to be on this panel and look forward to the conversation and answering questions. So when it comes to disinformation, one thing that can be challenging is coming up with a precise way to measure disinformation's impacts. We do know that it is more impactful now than it has been in the past. And a lot of that has to do with the speed at which it can be disseminated and to the degree actors can spread different messaging. So traditionally that's been through things like advertising and micro-targeting. That can now be done algorithmically as well. So without having to put advertising dollars behind it. But to Jamil's point, this isn't new. This has been going on for a long time. We used to just call disinformation lies. The reason why it works now, a lot of that has to do with frankly, the user interface and its ability to be disseminated quickly on digital and social media. So think about yourself for a second. When you are using social media, I'm going to pick on Facebook. Let's say you're scrolling through your Facebook app on your way to work pre-pandemic and you're sitting in traffic on the bus and you're just scrolling through your newsfeed and you're going through. How that information is curated depends on you as a user. It's what you react to. It's what you are searching for in your browsers. It is the information that you're engaging with, the pages that you like, the content that you share, the things that you click on, the things you comment on. And everybody has their own unique algorithm based on what it is that they like. Now, these companies are for-profit companies, and as we know, they make their money off of advertising revenue. There's nothing wrong with that. But what that means is that their algorithm is designed to show you the content it thinks you want to see. And it does that both by promoting content within your news feed that is paid for by an advertiser and is shown to you based on those likes and preferences. So there's an advertiser going through and actually micro-targeting you. And then it's also showing you things that it thinks you might just like, because it's kind of fun. If you like, one football team, maybe you're going to like another one once the Super Bowl comes around and yours is out. So that's one of the reasons why it works, is because it's be able to target us and our biases and what it thinks we want to see and hear in a way that's just unprecedented, by using the data that we're providing and the data that we're giving to these social media platforms. And these bad actors are taking advantage of that and showing you exactly what it is that you want to see, that will confirm your biases, make you angry, make you emotional, and get you to engage with and share that content.
Yeah. So it's interesting, Megan, so Lisa talks about the speed of communications that they happen, and sort of the ability to sort of focus in on a targeted audience and get that audience to sort of see messages that they agree with and that resonate with them. That might cause people to spiral down because they're seeing, views that are basically the same as theirs. They're not seeing contrary views. How might this affect elections, right? We talked about we know about the role that Russia tried to play in the 2016 elections. How do we see that playing out? Should we be concerned about the election infrastructure this time around? Is it about this social media disinformation? Is it about ballots? We've heard a lot about mail-in ballots. We've heard a lot about manipulations of internet voting systems in the polls. What should we be worried about here, and how can disinformation play a role in our electoral system, given what Lisa just told us about the speed of dissemination of information and the sort of the effort to push you information that is consistent with your existing biases or views?
Sure. Thanks, Jamil. Also echoing Lisa's thanks for having me today. I do serve as the executive director for the Americas region at the Global Cyber Alliance, but my comments and participation today are just my views alone, so please don't attribute them to anyone but me. Should we be concerned about the elections infrastructure? What role does disinformation play? Yes, I think generally speaking, we need to be concerned about both of these aspects of the situation. Of course, we also need to recognize the voters are, in the end, the ultimate trump card, no pun intended. So in terms of thinking about, where are we with elections infrastructure and the security, a lot has been accomplished in the past 4 years. There's been a significant amount of resources put to the security of the voting infrastructure. That's not to say that more can't be done. As I think everybody knows, elections are managed and administrated at the state and local level. The federal government can support through monetary means, financial means, and through some policy shifts that have taken place in the past 4 years, the state and local elections officials, but directing their actions is something that is forbidden. So, thinking about what has been changed, what has been accomplished over the past 4 years, it really comes down, I think, to three things: policy, people, and money. And you could ultimately say that really comes back to policy. So the policy decision was made to designate voting infrastructure as critical infrastructure. That allows DHS and its mission and statutory authorities to devote more attention, more finances, and people to working to secure the infrastructure. We know, I think most people know, that Matt Masterson is the leading this charge at DHS and doing a tremendous work under the direction of Director Krebs. But that also has the additional resources include things like the HAVA funds that many people have been talking about over the years that have really supported state and locals in boosting their security.
And HAVA is the Help America Vote Act, right?
Yes.
That was passed after the 2001 debacle, the Bush v. Gore in Florida, right?
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Okay.
The hanging chads, as some of us know.
Right.
So additional funds have been allocated to be dispersed through that process.
Right.
The EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, also offers some guidance and some resources. The nonprofit that I'm at offers free resources to elections officials to help better secure the infrastructure. Which goes to say, as far as we know, back to 2016 and since then, no vote has been changed.
Right.
Doesn't mean there hasn't been interference, and doesn't mean that there haven't been attempts to change votes, but it wasn't successful. And I think it's often the case that we want to focus on the fact that there were attempts and not remember, as scary as that is, that we should have confidence. And I think there is still more work that can be done to give voters a reason to have greater confidence. And so when we start to talk about how does disinformation play in this, we do expect that there will be a large amount of absentee voting and vote by mail. And so there really is an opportunity here for elections officials. I was reading the other day, I forget who was writing the article, saying, look, it's up to you guys to educate the voting populace to understand that it may take time actually for us to tabulate votes, but there is a process in place by which that happens. This is when we might, we expect to be allocating X number of votes to online balloting, not online balloting, mail-in balloting, not online. And we expect that might take us X number of days to process those votes. So you could reasonably expect the outcome to be determined at a certain point in time. I think it's just to close up here, I think in terms also of disinformation, it's really important for elections officials and voters to have an open line of communication, in the sense of, again, what I was saying, these are the steps that we're taking to make this as secure as possible. We as elections administrators are the most trusted source for information. So reading somebody's Facebook post that mail-in ballots, actually you don't have to mail it in until December 1st this year, that's not accurate. You need to be getting your information from the most trusted resource, and in that case, it's always the state and local elections officials.
Right. Well, so Matthew, let's talk about this for a second. So one of the things that Megan's telling us here is that, in large part, we haven't seen actual manipulations of votes, and what we're really concerned about is this disinformation trend and people being misled as to when their ballots are due or the like. Is there any tie here to the pandemic? Right, we've seen other nation states get involved in the pandemic. You saw sort of most famously the Chinese foreign ministry talking about the suggesting that the United States was responsible for the pandemic itself. We saw them get involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, decrying the condition of Black Americans in the United States. Of course, they have interned, 1 million Muslims in camps in the Xinjiang province. So, hard to believe that they're really concerned about that. And more seems like they're trying to influence our populace. But if they're doing that from the podium, right, from the foreign ministry, presumably they're doing stuff covertly also. We know the Russians did that in the prior election. How does this all tie together? The efforts by the Chinese and the Russians to manipulate our body politic when it comes to Black Lives Matter, or when it comes to the pandemic. How does that tie the elections? And should we be worried about that type of disinformation actually? Well, it's not changing votes. Might it affect people's voting behavior or who they prefer in the elections? And if so, how?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here with you and with my other co-panelists. And let me also say, as all lawyers would appreciate, that I'm here in a personal capacity and not speaking for my firm or my clients. So is it all connected? Absolutely, right? I mean, I just think one way to think about this is just like one more bit of evidence for the messed up information environment that we all live in now, where you have a cacophony of lies and propaganda that's going to be attacking you every day. And you mentioned the pandemic, and I think it's important to sort of focus on that for a moment, because I think that's crystallized a lot of these concerns and a lot of these channels. You have disinformation about vaccines, disinformation about treatments and therapeutics, about government action.
Sometimes coming from the government itself.
Right? Oh, right. I mean, I think that's important to remember, because in this messed up information environment, you've got a lot of different elements of disinformation. Frauds. If you go to the FTC website, I mean, they have a whole portal on just how much people are getting ripped off with, fake PPE manufacturers or loans and all the rest of it. So it's a bit of a jumble. But I do think, and I was thinking about this as we were preparing for this talk, that I should be controversial. And so I want to be controversially optimistic, right? So let me throw this out there.
That is controversial.
Yeah, this is controversial. So I think this actually may be an interesting, have a salutary effect on the election. And let me explain why. I mean, I think that what we've seen in the last several months, as I said, has crystallized a lot of these concerns. I think we see much more pushback from the press on blatant fabrications and falsehoods when it comes to vaccines and treatments. I think we see that with the platforms. I mean, the platforms have done more just as a purely factual matter, they've done more about COVID and COVID-related disinformation than they've done about political disinformation. They've done a lot of the things that many of their critics have asked them to do, whether it's takedowns or whether it's putting little bugs that say this is a trusted source, or this is a potentially an untrusted source, or this is a flag tweet or whatever. So there's that. There's the pushback. I think more people are becoming aware of disinformation. If you think of sort of disinformation as relying on a muscle, those muscles have kind of atrophied perhaps, or maybe they've never been exercised, and now we're getting this chance to exercise them. So, again, I might be wrong, but it would be interesting to see going forward if the public is not more informed about where to go for, reliable information, how to be a smarter consumer. So there's always going to be yutzes, to use the technical term, who are going to think that drinking, orange juice is going to cure the coronavirus. Right. And the same people.
I heard there are a lot of people saying that that's the case. A lot of people are saying that.
Well, I mean, there's been an interesting analysis actually on why people think vitamin C cures the coronavirus, and people think that it's actually related to the fact that people think that vitamin C helps cure the common cold. So basically, disinformation about one thing blends with disinformation about another.
They're both caused by coronaviruses, blah, blah, blah.
Kathleen Hall Jamieson at Penn has written about this. In any event, so just to wrap this up, I would just say that it could be this is a very important, not test case, but sort of forerunner of the election.
Yeah. So Megan, what about this point that Matthew just made about, the platforms doing a lot more when it comes to the pandemic? They've done the takedowns, they've done the like, right? Are we worried about sort of free speech issues here, right? Because I mean, who's to say one person's disinformation or misinformation, right? I know Lisa's gonna tell us there's a big difference between dis and misinformation, so we'll talk about that in a second. But Megan, should we be worried that these platforms are now taking actions that are gonna take people's views offline? I mean, look, I don't agree with anti-vaxxers, right? I think they're crazy. I've got some friends, unfortunately, that are anti-vaxxers that are not vaccinating their kids, which makes me crazy. But don't they have a right to talk about their crazy vaccine theories and their crazy theories about orange juice and coronavirus? I mean, how can we shut that down and call that misinformation or disinformation that's inappropriate? I mean, does that cut against our First Amendment concerns in this country?
I think in the first instance, we have to think about who's doing the action, right? So if it's a private actor, then the First Amendment concerns are, I don't want to render them obsolete, but it's really governmental action to remove speech that triggers the First Amendment right, or excuse me. But
what if they've created? I mean, they've created these public fora, right? I mean, it's not like I get that Twitter's a private forum, right? But it's basically the town square, right? It's the modern version of town square, right? So is it really appropriate for Twitter to decide, well, your theory of the world is inappropriate, so we're going to shut that version down and keep the other version going? Even if it is true that Anthony Fauci obviously knows more about the stuff than the rest of us do, and he should be the person we're listening to.
I will first make the disclaimer that I have not studied constitutional law in a long time, so I'm not the most educated to debate some of these issues, but I think it's important in the first instance to say, just as you are sometimes required to obtain a permit to speak in the town square and you have to comply with certain
time, place, and manner.
Yes, restrictions. So too, they're not perfect analogies, but Twitter, Facebook, and the others have terms of service, and they've outlined in advance what constitutes legitimate behavior, not legitimate, but authorized behavior, so to speak, on their platforms. The term that Facebook uses is coordinated inauthentic behavior, and they set forth a set of criteria by which they assess whether content meets or does not meet the coordinated inauthentic behavior practice. I think that the platforms have come a long way in, first of all, setting up these requirements. They've really begun to further articulate what it would mean to be using the platform for the purposes with which they organize it as a private actor, versus the types of uses that they find to be not consistent with what they're offering for the platform to do. They are being much more transparent, I would say. Some would argue that they could be much more further transparent around why they take certain speech down. So the work that Graphica, Twitter, Facebook, and some of the others have done over the years together, I think with Lisa's group and the DFRL lab at the Atlantic Council, is all serving to develop a body of evidence around what we think is acceptable, these social media platforms, and what is not. So while it's the First Amendment claims, I think, are ones that I often can be it's sort of the first string that we reach for, when I think in many cases we need to further educate the audience around the differences between these different types of rights, so to speak. And also I think, I think many people now know that there's an ability to report behavior that they think is problematic, but never hurts to remind them.
No, right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So Lisa, I mean, I know that you do some work on this for with some of the platform companies. So I don't want to ask you about something you can't talk about, but help us understand sort of how this plays out in real life, and are these real problems? And if they are, and should we be concerned about these things? And if so, what should we think about them? And have we seen the sort of the threat situation change since 2016? Because we knew we saw a lot of happening in 2016. So what does it look like now?
Yeah, so a couple things. So we don't work directly for the platforms, but we do work with them as investigators to pass along information that we think that they need to see when there are violations of community standards. And so in practice, the community standards are not always applied evenly. And you also have to remember too, these are private companies and they have to make resource decisions. And so just because we want them to investigate doesn't mean it's the number one investigation that's going to be on their list when they're balancing their other priorities. So I think that's important because it shows the power that the platforms have to both write the rules and then determine whether or not to enforce them and at what rate to enforce them. And so I think that that's kind of important to think about. And every once in a while, I'll just report for fun through the features within the platform. So on Twitter or on Facebook, and see how long it takes. And it can sometimes take up to a week. And if that is a piece of content that people are seeing and believing because it's part of an influence operation, or it's just a violation of community standards because it's hate speech, because it poses a threat of violence, how many people saw it and could potentially be influenced by it. So I do think that this has some very real consequences. So to bring it back to like what's happening now versus 2016, that kind of stuff. So in 2016, I do think, so I'm going to echo Matt's optimism because I feel like I'm the eternal pessimist. Your Jewish mother is so disappointed in you in this space. I am optimistic because we are talking about these issues. Like this isn't something that we were talking about in the summer of 2016. It just wasn't. So we now, when we uncover something, we don't have to say we uncovered an IRA troll farm, people, and then explain what an IRA troll farm is and get the average user to understand that. People know. Yeah. Talking about things like deepfakes before they've happened. So I think that in between what's different 2016 to now, I think public awareness is, and that's a huge, huge benefit. I think that the difference is bad actors are not necessarily seeding their narratives on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat to the same degree that they were in 2016. And that makes sense because we're all looking on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. Yeah. So I think that that's really important to remember, and that a lot of these narratives are now being seeded in like sketchy chat rooms, dark, deep corners of the internet, and relying on real people to then carry those on platforms. So when we talk though about foreign and domestic, I don't think it's all kind of jumbled together. So like you'll see like foreign over here, but then somebody who's domestic picked it up, and then going back to how those algorithmic silos, all of a sudden everybody in this algorithmic silo is now talking about it and being shown it. And then somebody from the one next to it pulls it over, and then it gets written on by like a fringe blog, and it gets picked up, and it keeps moving and moving towards the mainstream. And that's typically how these more nefarious narratives work. And so that's what we would consider disinformation versus misinformation, which is a social media user who just sees something and shares it without thinking or not knowing that it's false or not knowing it's nefarious. So I think that also poses one of the challenges. And so I also want to footstop one of Megan's other points, which is these are private companies. So they can do whatever they want. It's a question of whether or not they want to do it. And so I think that's important to remember as well. And I'm not a lawyer, but with regards to First Amendment rights, and we think about the ethics around this a lot, you as a citizen are free to say whatever it is that you want, but also these are global companies. So, that's not always going to be true in every country you're operating in, unfortunately. And so these companies have to write rules that aren't going to have unintended consequences when it comes to kind of the First Amendment and enforcement side of things. But it does make it challenging. And I do not envy the platforms. They're a little bit between a rock and a hard place of they need to act on this, but they need to respect people's ability to organize in these democratic ideals that we hold so dearly. So the other thing I would say that's different between, 2016 and 2020 is the Russians were just really good at manipulating the algorithm in 2016. Like a lot of the stuff they were doing on RT and just known Russian sources and that sort of thing. But now it's not just the Russians. Anybody can do this. For some people, it's just marketing. And so we now have, according to Global Disinformation Index, an organization that we work with closely and puts out great work. We now have 70 countries in the mix doing this. And so everybody is going to have a different goal and actor or motive and narrative that they're pushing depending on their goal. And so I think that's where it becomes a challenge, and that's where we can start having some real meaningful conversations around the appropriate policies. Because if the goal of these platforms is to be able to connect people for authentic conversations, then you can reframe the question of how do we stop as many inauthentic conversations from happening? How do we root that out? How do we better enforce the rules on the books? And how do we take all of the information available instead of just investigating what's on our own platform and instead put it into the broader ecosystem?
Well, so speaking about this on the platforms, I want to take one of our questions for the audience, and this I think I'll direct this to Matthew and Megan. I don't know which one you want to answer this one, but Daniel Monaderi asks, do you think these internal policy shifts at the platforms, I assume he means, are at all reflective of what the EU is doing in terms of its code of practice on online disinformation? I'm not particularly familiar with the EU's code of practice. I don't know, Megan, if you or Matthew are. Do either of you have a sense of whether that's reflective of that?
I'm not super familiar with the EU code of practice either, but I feel like I saw Megan nod. So maybe.
No, I don't have a deep understanding. I do recall when they passed it, or developed it. I think, so my bias would be to say they are aware of it, but they're much more, I think, concerned about regulatory responses in the United States in the first instance than they are overseas, which is not to say that things like GDPR are, let's not conflate the two. But the regulatory approach that was taken with the General Data Protection Regulation, whatever it should not be conflated with the impact and the attention that companies will pay to this, the code of practice. It is a code of practice as opposed to a regulatory approach. Right. And I think, we're all familiar with some of the perhaps embarrassing testimony and exchanges between our elected officials and members of the social media, representatives of the social media companies, reflecting, I think, really the absence of understanding about how complex it is to pass meaningful law in this space. That, as Lisa and others have pointed out, doesn't have potentially unintended consequences. There she was speaking about the actions of the social media companies, but here, we are, I think, still perhaps less shining than we used to be, or definitely less shining than we used to be, but people really still, around the country, around the world, we are perceived to be one of the elite thought leaders in this space around how do we manage the internet, and what types of policy and regulatory approaches do we take toward it. And I think it's really comes down to fear of what Washington might do in the first instance.
So let's talk about what Washington might do, and Matthew, and by the way, for the audience, folks, if you have more questions, put them in the chat function. Feel free to use the raise your hand feature there up in the participants box, and we'll call on you. But Matthew, help me think about this, because Megan made a really important point about the platforms responding to U.S. regulatory measures, and we saw the president issued an executive order on well, not necessarily on Twitter, but basically we know what motivated him. He made it very clear what was motivating him, and now we've had the Department of Commerce make a filing with the FCC following up on that executive order, and there is sort of some regulatory action happening, right, where the U.S. government is sort of saying, hey, we want to make sure that people are getting in not necessarily equal, but a fair share of the airtime on these platforms. I mean, isn't this just a return to the old fairness doctrine that we got rid of, back 15, 20 years ago? And does this make sense? I mean, is this the right approach? And if it is or isn't, how does that affect our views of what we can and what the policy system should do about these issues of disinformation, misinformation?
Right. I mean, it is a fertile time for these sorts of thoughts. But I do think that we have to sort of start with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is the 26 words that created the internet, according to the guy who literally wrote the book about the law. And what that allows is the platforms to not be liable for the content that someone else posts on them. But on the same time, so that's the immunity, right? But then it also gives them immunity to remove and moderate content without any kinds of claims. And so what the platforms will tell you is we need this because this allows us both to allow for your free expression, but also allows us to have moderation without worrying about these sorts of claims. So that if you take away one, you take away the other. And so then all of a sudden you have the problem that Megan started us off with, which was like, you then have to have the government decide. Or if you're a platform and you have to worry about being vicariously liable for a defamatory statement, you're going to have much less speech. I mean, these are not platforms that are made to constrain speech, right? These are made to allow for speech. And that's just simply how the internet was created. So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting proposals. I do think the president's actions is largely out of a result of personal pique. At least that's my view of it. I think that there's some more thoughtful proposals coming up from others. I don't think any of this will be resolved until after the election, and we'll see what the Congress looks like then. I do think that, I guess I'm sort of speculating here, but I do think that there's actually a mass of people who in the Congress who think that 230 is actually on balance a good thing. And what you want to do is you want to incentivize the moderation with and not just the other side of that coin, which is sort of posting.
Well, Lisa, what about that? I mean, so Matthew tells us that this protection for the companies is important because it allows them to create a free speech zone so that they're not liable for somebody who says bad things about somebody else or attacks somebody or the like. But they are making these content-based decisions, right? They are making judgment calls about what Donald Trump said was false or not false or inaccurate or was right about COVID or Anthony Fauci's right or wrong. I mean, they're making judgment calls at some level. Should they be free from all responsibility when making those judgment calls? I mean, if they're going to have their cake and eat it too, shouldn't it be, well, then you just got to keep it open to whatever speech. You don't make any moderation. You don't do any moderation. You just keep it wide open. But then if we do that, we have the problem of, child pornography. We have the problem of terrorist speech and hate speech. And I mean, how do we balance these things? Is there a way to balance these things? Is 230 the right approach? Is there something different? How should we think about these things from where you're seeing it?
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this again with not a lawyer, but I have obviously been following the policy conversations in this space pretty closely, and our work is hopefully part of what's informing these conversations. So with regards to Section 230, I think that's exactly right. They're having their cake and eating it too, and I just don't buy it. Like at this point, they are sending information to individuals. They're acting as editors and publishers, even with advertisements as well. And I think everybody is focused in on advertisements because it's the easiest to separate because there's dollars being thrown behind it. But then how do you account for these for-hire firms that are just designed to build audiences but never spend a dollar to advertise when they're being run out of foreign countries or being run for political purposes by political consultants without proper disclosures? And so I think we do need to move away from the advertising dollars conversation. And I also think that the Section 230 argument, I don't think that keeping it the way it is necessarily, I think there are more creative ways to get to the bottom of the problem. And so for me, from where I sit in being somebody who detects these networks and then helps our clients figure out how to mitigate them, whether it's through legal actions, a communications response, or working with platforms in instances of policy violation, amongst other things, we view the core issue as there's currently nobody responsible for stopping disinformation. We look at the federal government and they are responsible for collecting intelligence on, any foreign efforts, and the FBI can write an indictment for all of the Russians. And I promise you those Russians are never going to get extradited. We'll take that bet. The other challenge is, when we look at what's going on with the social media platforms, so this isn't even a hypothetical situation. This is an actual thing that has happened. There's an entity that is, pushing out false information. They're posting these clickbait kind of videos, that sort of thing, and they're craft videos targeting children. And they're telling these children to do really unsafe things, like, everything from like light different things on fire and see what burns hotter kind of stuff. And, if a child has access to this unsupervised and actually does it and gets hurt, who's responsible, and how are we even to enforce that? Is it the content creator who created the content and targeted children? Is it the people who, their advertisements were shown on it? Is it because, they're the ones who are in effect paying the content creator? Is it the platforms for showing this algorithmically to people? Is it the parent for not paying attention? Is it the child for not knowing any better and getting hurt? But at the end of the day, there's nobody who's really looking at this, I think, more from a consumer protection, from a voter protection matter, because we would never
who should
put that on TV.
Yeah. So who should, in your mind, Lisa? Like, do you have a theory about what the right answer is?
Yeah. So I have a couple of ideas. The first would be, right now what's happening is the platforms are self-policing with pressure from organizations like us and organizations and the press and activist community who are advocating for these various causes.
Right.
That's clearly not working, and the platforms are looking at this platform by platform. So Facebook isn't saying like, hey, Twitter, can I see your data on this stuff? There isn't some sort of information sharing component. There isn't an independent auditor. There's a role, I think, for government there to a degree. It needs to be done really carefully. And going back to a point that Megan made earlier, everything that's going to be done needs to be communicated very clearly as to exactly what's happening in order to maintain public trust, or I should say build public trust in the ability to do this. I think if there is a financial incentive to this, I think that that needs to be taken into consideration, and that content creators should potentially be the ones who are liable. But at the end of the day, all of this, the platforms are profiting off of people creating this content, off of users being on their platforms. And so then the question becomes, what's their role and responsibility? And frankly, I think that they do have responsibility because they've created the environment, so they need to at least cooperate. If there were a murder in the Hilton, we would expect the Hilton to let the investigators come in and figure out what happened. And that's the piece that, if it's happening, it's not happening. And I don't know if anyone can hear my quaint landline in the back. I apologize. If it's happening, it is happening it is not happening in a way that warns the public, and it's not happening in a way that looks at the problem holistically, but rather small parts of the problem.
Yeah. So Matthew, how about that? I mean, don't the platforms have a responsibility here to moderate this stuff and to address these concerns that Lisa has raised? And if they do, how do we enforce that upon them if they don't want regulatory action? They're free from liability when it comes to 230. Is there another way? I mean, can we rely on them to do the right thing because they have an economic incentive to do so? What about when the economic incentive cuts the other way, that they're selling ads and they benefit from people being in these sort of groups where they're getting more engaged and more spun up and more whatever, is that a concern? And I want to raise a question that one of our audience members raised in connection with this. Stan Nikolova asks that during the congressional hearings, right, with social media platforms, some of these policies were based previously on FCC regulations, right? And is there a need or a potential change coming in FCC regulations? And if so, what might that look like? And what relevance does that have to sort of this question of platforms' responsibility and the like?
Right. Well, let me answer that question in this way, which is to say, I don't think that we can always be so doubtful of the market mechanisms like failing. Or put another way, I think we can.
All right, you're on board with market mechanisms. I love it. All right.
I think that, I think the fact is that Facebook and these other companies, or all platforms, they want their users, to use their services, but they want them to be happy. They want good press. They want to be good global citizens. They're responsible to shareholders for a number of things, and profits obviously, but also they don't want to come under the crosshairs of any kind of regulatory authority. So I think there are lots of it's not true in my view that they're just maniacally after this or that dollar. In fact, I think platform leaders.
Well, Really? I mean, like, come on. I mean, look, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, corporations exist to make profits for their shareholders. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But
I get
the
to push
question
back
is
a little bit,
in
though.
making that money. Yeah.
I think that it's more correct to think of this in a more holistic setting, which is that yes, if you want revenue and if you want users, you can't be a complete cluster, right? I mean, like, this
right.
like why like they think Parlay is going to be terrible, right? Because Parlay is this idea that it's this free of all moderation. You're going to get on and you're gonna be able to call everybody a Nazi and like
well, it's why nobody who's actually has a brain is on 4chan, right? Unless they're doing it for work purposes, like Lisa might be doing, right? But like nobody's on 4chan because they want to be on 4chan, unless maybe some people are, but look, nobody I want to spend time with is on 4chan.
Right. I mean, so I guess that's my point. The idea is that that these companies succeed when they have healthy communities, and I think that good content moderation, taking down stuff that is faulty, vaccine information, promoting CDC guidance, all of these things are actually, I think, rowing in the same direction when it comes to things like profits.
So can I just jump in on that really quickly? Because I do think it's also important to note, though, and this is why I think regulation is really important. It took a long time for platforms to get their act together around the coronavirus disinformation. And I think that's really important to note, because especially during those critical first months when we were still learning about the virus, what was safe and not safe, a lot of things were able to specifically fester in closed groups. And so those communities and closed groups are treated differently than the kind of like more public facing sort of stuff, because you have to be a member. Those group dynamics are really dangerous in terms of radicalization. And I'm not necessarily talking about from a terrorism perspective, but also from a terrorism perspective, when it comes to whether or not people believe conspiracy theories, when it comes to what type of content that you're being shown. And so while I think that there has been some progress made, I think that, there's no way to really study or prove this, but I would be very curious to know what information people who think they don't have to wear a mask in order to stay safe are being shown on the platforms, and were being shown from the platforms very early on. And to be clear, this is bigger than just platforms on some of these issues. Like, it's also legitimate news outlets that are questioning whether or not a mask is needed. It's state media outlets. It's more above board things than just like a nefarious guy in his basement pushing these narratives. But I do think that without any structure or understanding of who is responsible for stopping this and who is accountable to the public and to users and to, the Western liberal order, we're going to continue to keep having these conversations.
Well, but Lisa, let me push back on that, because, there are people who take the view, informed, intelligent people who take the view that they don't need to wear masks. I mean, they're again, I may not agree with them, right? You may not agree with them, but there are people who have that view. And is it really the job of a technology platform to decide masks must be worn, and we're only going to allow messages on our platform that say masks must be worn? Anybody who says you shouldn't wear a mask or suggest that that's not an appropriate a precautionary measure, we should take that down, whether that's the president of the United States, which is where he was for a long time, right? Or anybody else. I mean, is that really what we want these platforms, the business of doing? And if so, let's say we do believe that. Well, one, do we believe that? And second, if we do believe that, who tells them? Who decides? Is it the government? Is it somebody else?
So these are all the questions that we need to be asking, because also I can start with what I personally believe, and I can then start with like the other questions that we should be asking. So I don't necessarily think that it's the role of a technology company to be able to determine what goes up and what goes down. But if you have community standards, they need to be enforced evenly. If you are going to be writing rules, they need to be applied no matter who you are, because a Democratic deal is no one's above the law.
Right.
I think the question, though, that we're trying to answer, and this is where the Section 230 debate comes in, is Facebook and Twitter and Instagram a technology platform? What are they? And so I think, are they a news dissemination platform? Are they, more of like an email provider? So I think it really does. These are the questions that we need to ask. And then who's responsible for investigating? Is it the platforms? Because if it's the platforms, they're not going to be able to they have made the decision that they are not going to be able to catch everything. And so then who is responsible? Who's responsible for picking up the slack? Because at the end of the day, if it's targeting a company, if it's targeting, look at what happened with QAnon and Wayfair. If it's targeting a company, if it's targeting an individual user trying to learn about coronavirus, how is that individual who had, been targeted or saw disinformation, believed it, and changed their behavior? Should they just be responsible? Should they be the ones to say, like, wait a second, I'm going to listen to CDC guidance? But this is what we haven't had a meaningful conversation about to determine a path forward in terms of tactically, even if we change Section 230, who has the authority to determine?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. So look, I mean, let's put this in really practical terms, Megan. It seems like disinformation is actually having an effect on some of the 2020 election stuff. And by the way, for the audience, again, we can talk about this all day long, and for the next 15 minutes we've got left. So if you've got questions, please jump in, throw your questions in the chat box, or raise your hand. But Megan, the New York Times suggested that there was a domestic conspiracy theory, right, that was not created by the Russians, but was actually a domestic conspiracy theory that going around about the failed Iowa caucus reporting app, right? And it was picked up though by Russian trolls and amplified by Russian trolls, and in particular by the Internet Research Agency, which was indicted by Bob Mueller during the investigation. Do we worry that, I mean, is that foreign myths or disinformation where they're taking a U.S.-based, a domestic-based conspiracy theory and just simply amplifying it? Like, should we be worried about it? Should we be worried about that? And is that a different tactic than previously used in the 2016 elections?
So I think, yes, we should be worried about it. To me, I sort of see it as like almost a blended threat, so to speak. So Lisa and I think, actually met a couple of summers ago. I think this is, to answer the question in the first case, I think it's more of the same. In some ways, they've been able to, the Russians have obviously fine-tuned their tactics. But there was research that Pew conducted, I think it was over the 2016 elections and following on, which was actually demonstrating that in many cases it was amplification of so-called legitimate speech, meaning it wasn't necessarily inaccurate speech. It might have been, it wasn't necessarily problematic speech. It was just wrong, and they leveraged that to further sow the wedge between different political groups in the United States. So I think, to Lisa's point earlier, we have come a long way. There, I think, I don't know what Lisa was saying. I do think we have come a long way. I think there is closer collaboration between the social media companies. There is certainly much more that can be done. But I do think that, and what's unfortunate, I think, Jamil and I and others have probably have lived through a little bit too much of this, but you have to see it to believe it in order for people to really be willing to take action. And that's back to the question about, should these social media companies be doing something about it? You cannot develop a car that the brakes don't work and put it on the market, right? You're going to be held accountable. So how do we formulate better policies around this space is something that I don't have answers to. One could take the approach of, in order to, and furthermore, you don't even have to have a license, right? To get, it's not like the phone company where you have to go to the FCC to get a license to host a social media platform.
Right.
You just put it up there.
Just create it.
So we don't have any of these gating.
Yeah, that's made the technology community really dynamic, right, Megan? I mean, so like, do we want to kill that dynamism? I mean, should there be a permitting process to set up a social media platform? Maybe that's the answer.
I'm not going to go out there and say one way or the other. I think if one were to follow that approach, you would then, as we're seeing in the case of, for example, cybersecurity policy, there are kind of these technology neutral ways of saying thou shalt have terms of service and user guidelines, not necessarily, you must have
what
a process
they say,
to, right. You must have a process to respond to, for example, what's the equivalent of vulnerability disclosure in the social media space? If it's, many of the social media platforms do have that, some of the bigger ones, but as Lisa was mentioning earlier, some of this stuff we just don't even know where it is, and we as concerned citizens, and in some cases those who have an ability to try, and a responsibility in the sense of developing companies around this stuff to try and ferret it out, it's becoming harder and harder. So,
hey, Jamil, can I do a curveball?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
So one thing that I think is we haven't discussed at all is really the decline in institutional trust, sort of the disinformation
I was actually gonna ask you about this. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
This is great. No, this is great. Please.
Yeah, I mean, and just that, like, this stuff would be a lot less dangerous if people actually believed, central institutions, right? If they listened to the CDC, if they believed what the police were telling them and all of that. And it seems to me that one of the things that we don't have in this country is a reliable sort of public information system, or one that is at least widely supported and believed in. And
what do you mean by that, Matthew? Do you mean like a Voice of America type of thing? What do you mean like a government resource? Because
I
think about this.
Is that we have these institutions. It's just that they sort of they reach through the bog, right? I mean, like the CDC has to filter its information through all of these layers of doubt and cynicism. And I don't have
created by by the way other parts of government.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I don't have a great solution, but it seems to me that there are two parts of it, at least right now. One is, of course, for all of these institutions to be on all of these channels, right? So they make sure that they've, I follow DHS and all the government agencies on Twitter, so for to be on all of them. But second, to speak credibly, right? I mean, this might be an example where more incredible speech is actually a good antidote, but the importance is the credibility part. And I do think the more these institutions, become, if I may say, corrupted by speech about Antifa or, the dangers of mail-in ballots or whatever, the more credibility they lose. And it can work on the other side too. I mean, I don't want to pretend that there's only one political vector here, but it does seem to me that if we only talk about this this information environment as a bunch of people talking to each other without the benefit of having institutions that can actually mete out credible information, we're losing something.
Yeah. So actually another question from the audience. Alyssa Aguilar asks that Twitter announced this morning they would have new labels for government and state affiliated media accounts. So this sort of to your point, Matthew, about at least we might get some, either you know to trust it or know to be concerned about it. Might that have an impact on what you're talking about, and particularly during an election year?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question that comes now. Yeah, I mean, it might. I suppose it does come down to whether or not you trust it, right? I mean, because if I saw a label that said this is, the Chinese CCP television, I would be less likely to believe it. But I still believe that most of what the U.S. government puts out there is accurate. So I think it comes down to fundamental trust. But I do think that that's, I suppose, a step in the right direction, because it's more about the validating the source.
Yeah. So, Lisa, I mean, does this solve the problem without sort of government regulation? I mean, if we just sort of start labeling everything, hey, look, this comes from this source. We sort of like truth in advertising, right? And it's not just applied to ads, to your point about this has to go past the ads, it has to go to all the content, right? And it's like, okay, look, this is who's really behind this, right? This is the Russian state media, this is the U.S. government, this is the CDC, this is the White House. Now, clearly, at times, those voices may speak with different voices, right? We've seen the White House say different things than CDC says, right? So there might be different voices, but at least if you know where everything's coming, this is sort of the campaign finance approach, right? As long as we have transparency, right, that solves a lot of these problems. Is that a solution in your mind, or does that not go far enough?
No, I think that that's a great solution, but it's not the only solution. I don't think that there's a silver bullet to this. Otherwise, we would fix this. So I think the labels are really important. I know knowing where information is coming from is really important. Not to be that person who talks about their own research, but we did a public-facing report on something similar that I think actually is a pretty good example of how we need to go a step further. So we published a report about this entity that was run by Russians out of Cyprus that was creating a bunch of clickbait, and like every once in a while they do like weird political stuff. They bought some ads in rubles. And when we approached the platforms about this, and this wasn't just like an obscure thing. This was the third largest entity on social media behind Comcast and Disney in the entertainment category. So it's like massive. And so when we approached the platforms, one of the things that they did after we had approached them with this information before we released the report, is they added a way to see what the company was that was running the entity or running all these social media assets. And like, that's great, but it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you who's behind it. It told you that it was in Cyprus, but it didn't tell you it was run by Russians. It didn't, so on and so forth. And so I think this goes back to it'll work to a degree. It may
Mhm.
also create like a false sense of
Security.
information
Yeah.
and security. So I'm all for labeling government accounts and state-run media accounts and that sort of thing. But then you also get into the question, and Matt brought this up, and I think it's important that like social media platforms or government agencies and trusted voices are all on social media platforms. If you've ever read your average government social media account, it is the most boring, sterile thing that has been reviewed
Right.
by all
Right.
of you lawyers. And like, it's just like, it just gets no engagement. And so
Right.
if you want to see a good government account, I highly recommend following New Jersey government. It's hilarious. I'm not from New Jersey, by the way, so I can be a little unbiased here. But there, I think, are other things that the platforms can do to help this situation too, because a lot of it has to do with the algorithm. So what if during an emergency, for example, CDC is the most promoted within the algorithm, and they've done that for the search function, but I never see CDC information about coronavirus in any of my social media feeds.
Maybe because you're an anti-vaxxer. Who knew?
Don't tell anyone. It's like the biggest kept secret at Alethea Group, but it's, I'm not an anti-vaxxer for the record. But it is the kind of thing where it's a start. It's not the end point, but I'm gonna applaud Twitter for this move. Twitter has actually, again, in case anyone can't tell, I'm really skeptical of the social media platforms. Twitter in the last 6 months has really given me hope, and I'm heartened to see that some of the other major social media platforms are finally starting to follow in their footsteps.
Gotcha. So we have another question from the audience. Staniela Nikolova asks, what happens when you have a private account that posts official government responses like the president's account? And what about when lines are blurred because, the traditionals or informal policies isn't being followed from one administration to the next? How would a social media company even be able to build an algorithm around that problem, right? How do you label the real Donald Trump account? Is that a government account? Is that a private account? Is it both? Is it neither? I mean, Megan, how do we think about these things?
It's a good question. So I would, if for those in the audience who have not yet found, there are a number of great legal blogs out there, Lawfare being one, Just Security is another. There are a couple of others that are escaping me at the moment, but around the analysis of Trump's personal Twitter account and the public White House account, there I think are a few blog posts on there. I would encourage folks to look at those. I think that, not to be too crass about this, but social media companies, as we've already talked about and I think agreed upon, are in the business of making money. If they want to hold users on their platforms, they're going to figure out a way, in part, to address some of these questions. And so, it is a challenge to, as we've talked about, also to write policies that will not have unintended consequences. It's also critically important, and I think, I agree with Lisa. I think there's been some, Twitter has been good. I think I just actually happened to notice that Facebook has now published its report from July around coordinated inauthentic behavior and what it has done. They are making progress and they are figuring out ways to address these. Would we all like for them to move faster? Yes. Would we like for the government to move faster and in some ways differently? Absolutely. But this is a great experiment, right? It's not perfect. It's still a very immature theater if you think about it in terms of, I hate to go there. We didn't actually get a chance to talk about CyberCon, which I'm perfectly happy about. We're still, there's a lot to learn about this space, and we just have to hope, back to a point I made a few minutes ago, that we don't have to have another one of these see it to believe it experiences in order for there to be real, meaningful action. Not to say imposing regulation that actually has no impact or has significantly deleterious impact on social media. We do know, as in many cases, this is the only platform that people are able to access and use, or the one that they trust the most. And so action is necessary. I don't have all the solutions, but it's important to talk about these things.
Well, look, I think that's a great note to end on. We're at 2 minutes to the hour. So thanks everyone for joining us. Matthew, Lisa, Megan, thanks for a great conversation. If you all are interested in learning more about the National Security Institute, please check out our website at nationalsecurity.gmu.edu. It's in the chat box. Also, I'm excited to announce the launch of our newest LLM program in cyber intelligence and national security law. It's the first of its kind in the country. LLM prepares students to be experts in the policy areas that we talked about today, both in national security and cyber and the like. Application deadline is passed, unfortunately, for this semester, but there's a second deadline in December 1st. So if you're interested, please apply. Tell your friends. You can find out more about it on the GMU Law School's website. With that, Emily, with 1 minute left, back to you. Thanks so much for having us, and thanks to Phi Alpha Delta and the audience.